All right, so I want to talk a little bit about what you see in Ebony magazine specifically, and I want to make sure, I talked about this a little bit in the reading, but you understand kind of the significance of Ebony magazine in shaping Black consumerism and the narratives about Black people as consumers in the mid-20th century. So this magazine was established in 1945, and you read a little bit about this, but I want to talk about how Johnson kind of saw the purpose behind the magazine itself, and then a little bit about the issues that I had you look through. So Ebony, like I said, began in 1945, and Johnson said the purpose was to mirror the happier side of Black life, right? And he called it, a magazine that would look at the positive, everyday achievements from Harlem to Hollywood. But he also said that, and I'll do a quote, when we talk about race as the number one problem of America, we'll talk Turkey, right? So in other words, he wanted Ebony to be, kind of something that would highlight Black success and middle-class Black life and achievements, right? Especially in contrast to the realities of anti-Blackness that readers were experiencing every day. But he also wanted to be a space where issues of racism and anti-Blackness would be addressed. And so it's an interesting thing to think about this as a magazine dedicated to kind of as a vehicle for advertisement and consumerism, but also an attempt to engage with questions of racism in America. So there's already some inherent contradictions in what the magazine was meant to do. I will point out to you, if you're wondering, so you were able to access a couple of the issues here, and that's thankfully because Ebony collaborated with Google a while back to preserve public access. I know that's going to change soon. I forget the name of it, but the African American Museum that's part of the Smithsonian is, I think, gotten access to or rights to all of Ebony's issues, but for now, they're still online archives via Google. So that's made it really convenient to look through these, and hopefully you enjoyed looking through some of these. You'll notice how long these magazines are and how much of them are advertising, right? So I didn't expect you to read every page, obviously, but I want to at least highlight for you in this kind of lecture video some of the key things. So let's take a look at the 1965 issue, which I think I should have up for you. And you have to excuse if you heard that, my dog's shaking. He always interrupts when I'm doing these videos. So this one with the stark image, the white problem in America, right? And if you're not familiar, at the time, racism was discussed in terms of like the Negro problem, right? So that was the public kind of discourse when they talked about questions of anti-Blackness and racism, all right? And so this was an interesting issue because it reframed and kind of subverted that idea of the so-called Negro problem, right? So, and even one of the contributing writers states there's no Negro problem in America. The problem of race in America is a white problem. You hear a lot of that now. You hear a lot of that from James Baldwin if you're familiar with his work. But it's pretty progressive for this magazine to be putting out there, especially in 1965, that this problem is a white problem, right? So you have this, see if I can scroll through here. You have in the magazine, and I might do it this way, lots of advertisements, right? But you also have lots of, is this not going to let me scroll anymore? I'm wondering what that might be about. Here we go. Tons of advertisements, but you also have a lot of specific essays throughout it that talk about questions of racism, right? And so there's one that, talks about housing in particular. There's actually a few times they talk about housing. But I hope you took note of that, right? Because even at the time that these policies are being enacted, and again, this is just a few years before the Fair Housing Act, but as we know, that didn't change things too radically. It's worth noting that people are talking in this magazine about housing as one of the, as they call it, the most deeply rooted, most doggedly defended forms of racial discrimination, right? So this class, as we're talking about space, as we're talking about geographic segregation, this isn't just my thought, but the people living it at the time are seeing housing discrimination as one of the most prominent forms of anti-blackness, right? So, hopefully you're noticing and reading some of these conversations. Here's that quote, by the way, where it says there's no Negro problem in America. The problem of race is a white problem. And this essay, I'd say, if you didn't, you might want to read through it. Lerone Bennett Jr. Is one of the main editors and contributors to Ebony, or was, I should say, during this time, and has a lot of really interesting essays throughout. Hopefully, too, looking through this gives you a sense of how people were thinking and talking about questions of racism and geographic segregation. But what I want you to think about are some of the ads too that you see throughout this. So something that I noticed when I was analyzing this, and I hope you notice, is it's somewhat jarring that you have this great kind of critique of race and racism on one hand, right? You see the images of, so-called slums and what was left to black people for their housing and urban segregation. You see the laughing, kind of smiling white men. You see police brutality and violence here, right? But you see, right side by side, this kind of mass consumerism. And there's something jarring about that, right? Especially when we think about that tension of Ebony as a magazine that's on one hand trying to dig into questions of black experience and blackness in the U.S., but on the other hand, it wants to be a vehicle for white businesses to sell to black people, right? And so you see specific cars are being marketed, hair pomade for men, cigarettes, of course, show up quite a bit, alcohol, right? You see, again, and then you go from that to, buy your cigarettes and your alcohol to, let's talk about white terrorism. So it's interesting, I think, to think about the juxtaposition here of these white hate groups and then, buy your 7-Up. That's one thing I'm hoping you notice throughout. There's one ad, I'm hoping to find it here in particular, or one disposition I think that's interesting here, or juxtaposition, excuse me. See if I can find the one I'm looking at. Also, their critique of white liberalism is pretty funny in here. Here it is. So this is an essay throughout where, again, I think this is Lerone Bennett Jr. who talks about white liberalism, and he talks a little bit about some of the kind of hypocrisy and issues in that, but also kind of the role of white liberals in promoting kind of civil rights. So there's a pretty nuanced discussion going on in there. But this, not even on the opposite page, right? Shared on that very same page where he's kind of critiquing this, is this ad for Ultra Wave hair, which is a straightener for men. And so you have on one hand this critical exploration of white liberalism right there, side by side, same page, as this promotion of really white supremacist beauty products, right? To say, here's how you become desirable, here's how you succeed in the world. It's by making your hair look like white hair. So it's interesting to think, on one hand, Ebony's readers are urged to think critically about, questions of racism, racial progress, and white liberalism. But on the other hand, they're offered a way to assimilate to white beauty standards, right? And I think these stark contrasting ideologies really challenge Ebony's self-construction as a publication, because you can't be completely about kind of black progress if you're more concerned with how many ads you can squeeze in and not really thinking critically about what those ads are. So it's interesting, I guess, to think, I guess just the complex reality. But even as I think black readers and even black editors and businessmen and people contributing to this are challenging their position in the racial hierarchy, they're also reaffirming certain kind of questions of respectability through consumerism. And this maybe gives us some sense of how we ended up with the kind of dangerous narratives and perceptions of black people and black consumer habits today. I'm going to skip over to the 1963 issue, right? And again, I'm picking purposely the issues that are tied to kind of very obvious racial commentary here. So this one was celebrating the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And so that's why you have, usually if you looked at some of the other images, you have like a, black celebrity or someone on the cover, and they're very colorful images. But here you get the stark black and white image of Frederick Douglass, right? So it really sets a tone like this is a serious issue. We're going to talk about some serious stuff. And even within it, see if I like to do the double page. There's a statement that Johnson makes. Let's see if I can find it. He often has these publisher statements, FYI, if you didn't notice some of them in here. Can't remember what page it's on here. Here we go. Statement from the publisher, right? And he talks about, in here he says, the freedom proclaimed by Abraham Lincoln is not yet a reality. It's restricted today by state laws in the South, by moribund customs in the North, by fear, anxieties, and rigidities of millions in the South, North, East, and West, right? So he really makes this, huge claim that, like, yes, we're 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, but black people are still suffering at the hands of white supremacy, and it's not just in the South, right? Makes sense. Solid commentary here. But if you've taken time to scroll through here, you'll notice, yes, you have these statements from presidents, which, side note, some of these were pre-published, but that's another conversation. You have, I just want to point this out to you in case you're Kenneth Clark, which we talked about in I think I talked to you about him in another lecture, just so you know. Him being noticed here. Him being shown here. But look through how many of this are interesting, ads, right, for cigarettes. So Gwendolyn Brooks, which I think I'm going to have you read Gwendolyn Brooks. I believe I'm having you read a little bit of her when we start literature next week. Fantastic poet. Yes, Pulitzer Prize winner, but just an amazing poet. Black woman poet. They have the inclusion of like these great writers and essays, but then you have a magazine that is over 60% in this very special issue meant to focus on, history and race. 60% of this magazine is actually all advertisements, and primarily for food, clothes, cosmetics, liquor, television sets, radios, and cars. So it's interesting to think how you can have, again, this heavy conversation and critique, while on the other hand, you're marketing and selling a very particular set of goods and habits and constructing a very particular idea of black people as consumers, right? So overall, and I'm not going to go through every page here. I assigned this for you to look through, and it's very interesting. And the essays, I hope you read some of them. There's good that's being done here, right? And I want to acknowledge that. But on the other hand, you have to think about that for most of these, which are almost 200 pages, most of it is filled, at least, the majority of it is filled with advertisements, right? And so on one hand, you have, 30 to 40% are essays celebrating black life or challenging racism, but 60 to 70% of these ads are focused on particular consumer goods for black people, right? And Johnson was very frank about this. He was very proud of it. He actually, talked about how Ebony was only second to Holiday magazine in total advertisements. So he wanted it to be, this wasn't normal, I should say, for the time, right? It was second to Holiday in terms of how many advertisements were in the magazine. So it's a lot of ads, even for the era, right? And it was among the top 60% or 60 magazines, not percent, in beer advertising, 5th in like cosmetics or drug proprietaries, 8th in cigarettes, 10th in liquor, and 12th in canned goods, and 16th in shoes and cosmetics. And this is comparing to all magazines nationally, right? So Johnson was very proud that he's, top 20, top 10 when it comes to cosmetics, food, liquor, clothing, those kind of goods, right? But when you really put this in the context of what's happening in mainstream white magazines, you get a very different idea of what's going on here. And I know you heard a little bit of this in the lecture that you listened to last week, but I just want to reiterate some of this. So Ebony magazine was designed to be kind of the Black version of Life magazine. So the mainstream magazine for Black consumers and Black life. So it's a good kind of counterpoint to think about kind of what's going on there. So in contrast to what you see in magazines like Life, Black consumers were disproportionately targeted for the sale of clothes, cosmetics, usually skin whitening and hair straightening cosmetics, accessories, cars, and musical instruments, right? So of course, these same goods were sold to white Americans, with the exception of the skin whitening and hair straightening products. But white consumerism was very distinct in a couple of ways. So for one, there's a lot more variance in branding. So car ads in Life magazine, for example, had a lot more luxury brands and imports, where Ebony did not have those, right? So think about what that says about Black consumers or perceptions of Black consumers when they're not sold luxury or imports. A second big difference was the amount and types of home goods that were marketed. So on average, there were 3 times as many ads for home goods in magazines like Life than there were in Ebony, right? And more so in Life magazine or white magazines across the nation, you have ads for things like windows and flooring and other products that are actually tied to ownership, right? Those rarely, if ever, appeared in Ebony, and I have poured through these magazines. So they weren't non-existent, but they were very rare. Instead, you get home goods that are about furniture, house cleaning, certain appliances that you might need for an apartment. So it seems like a very clear understanding of, again, whiteness as kind of middle-class home ownership and Blackness as brand conscious, image conscious, urban, has money, but doesn't actually own anything, right? So what does that begin to see, or what does that begin to tell us in terms of narratives about Black people themselves, right? So I was gonna, do I have this image on here? I don't know if I do. Oh yeah, okay, so let me just show you this one kind of example of when you see a home good. And I don't know if this is in if I signed you this issue of Ebony, but I'll at least show you this. So this is Bassett Furniture, and so they're a Virginia-based company who, they actually use Black models, which is significant. Not always, but here in this image in Ebony. So I want to make that clear, right? So it's very clearly targeted towards Black consumers, right? So it's interesting to think about this, though, in terms of audience, right? Notice this image here. I just want to show you where they're at, right? So it does use this image, and you can't really read it, but image and language of luxury to promote furniture, right? So furniture, these are home goods, absolutely, but furniture doesn't signify ownership necessarily, right? On the contrast, it really just gives the appearance of ownership, right? So you're investing in your home environment, but that doesn't mean you necessarily own that home environment. And if you notice here in the top left-hand corner out this window, what does that look like to you? Right? So that's an elevated city landscape, which suggests that this Black mother and child are in an apartment, right? And so this is an interesting way that, white companies like Bassett are using Black models, but still very conscientious of the idea that Black people are not homeowners, right? So they want to sell them the idea of Black kind of middle class goods. You want the nice fancy furniture, you want to have this nice home environment, but we know you're not necessarily suburban homeowners, right? And again, I'm doing this close reading not to say this is the be-all end-all and that there weren't Black homeowners, but to show, again, the way that there were these subconscious or kind of hegemonic ideologies around Blackness and Black consumers. Because that's what I want you to have kind of a takeaway from this. Between the other video and this, you really should be getting a sense of what was happening. Well, we have home goods and home ownership shaping perceptions of middle-class whiteness and American belonging in the mid-20th century. What's happening for Black people at that time? That's a question I posed to you last week. And these images in Ebony and the things I talked about in the other lecture video should really be helping answer that for you. So here's what I want you to leave with. The idea that the connections between public housing policy and even private practice really only tell part of the story of how the streets or the hood came to exist as a kind of a socio-cultural entity, right? So yes, the physical space of the streets were created through government housing policy. That's how we got this geographic segregation and the economic disparities we talked about before. But the socio-cultural meaning was constructed in other ways. And this week and last week, what I really want you to have been thinking about is the way that marketing helped contribute to this social or cultural meaning of the streets or the hood and blackness itself, right? So hopefully what I've shown you is that the policies that created kind of that physical geographic segregation really reached beyond that immediate sphere to facilitate very particular racial formations around Black urban identity. So one example of this is the particular way Black consumers were perceived in contrast to all other Americans, right? And that's something we heard in The Secret of Selling the Negro video, and that you'll see in other places, right? Here's the regular American consumer, and then here's the Negro market, right? As a result of this kind of dual or segregated marketing practices, there emerged radically different images of white and Black consumerism. So on one hand, white Americans were understood as largely middle-class consumers who prioritized spending on long-lasting investments, like and there, a lot of times in Life magazine, you had things that were about their flooring or their windows or things that would build the equity of their homes, right? Or luxury cars or things like that. On the other hand, Black Americans were perceived as poor urbanites, right, who did have money to spend, right, but this money was spent on kind of passing or ephemeral products like clothes, cars, cosmetics, food, and liquor. And that's why Ebony magazine is just saturated for ads that are for those products, right? So, I want you to get kind of take away the idea that Black consumerism was shaped purposely and distinctly through these marketing practices, and that also shaped kind of aspects of Black urban life and identity, and it helped to really codify Blackness as urban, as flashy, as fetishizing certain commodities and name brands instead of being kind of more financially savvy. And those are narratives we hear today. We hear them in the news. We hear them internalized by Black people themselves, right? The idea that, you hear this often in kind of, I forget what we call it online. I forget the name for it, but it's like Rise and Shine Twitter that's like, hey, get on your grind if you just, or maybe if you follow things like this. I think T.I. was recently making some waves because he told people to spend their stimulus checks on property, but $1,200 doesn't buy you property anywhere in the United States, right? But this perception, even internalized among Black people, that, the reason why Black people are poor is because they're just not making smart financial decisions because they spend their money on, Gucci and Prada and these passing things, right? There's two things I want you to take from this. One is that part of those consumer habits and the pressure to do that was cultivated through these early marketing practices, right? Through targeting Black people and saying, you want to show your worth to white America, you want to show your worth to white business owners, spend your money on these things that they're marketing to you, right? And two, we know that the real source of this poverty are those policies that we looked at that disproportionately put ownership and equity that only grew and compounded over time in the hands of white Americans. So we know that those narratives are problematic and, false in a number of ways, right? So when you hear people kind of, critique Black people, Black urban people, and their consumer habits as being kind of extravagant and flashy and focusing on income status symbols instead of saving up and pulling themselves up, by their bootstraps, I want you to know that those narratives fail to acknowledge the ways that these spending habits were carefully crafted by institutions in power over the past century, right? And that this so-called extravagance of Black urban life is not the result of some inherent kind of deficiency or pathology in Blackness itself, but really it's the effect of the streets, of the social construction of Black urbanness and identity and space operating as they were intended to, right? What I'm trying to get you to take away is that these consumer habits were crafted very carefully over time through the kind of collective work of white business owners and, advertisers who you heard about in the last video, really shaped and contributed and reinforced the perception of the urban Black consumer wanting these goods and not those, and inherently they like this and not that. And all of these things really reinforce the idea that Black people are inherently different in how they spend and lesser, and that they're unwise, right? And so I think that hopefully one of the things you take away from this is just the falseness of a lot of those narratives, and maybe a better sense of where they came from, and maybe how you can work to deconstruct those.